We cannot eliminate uncertainty in this time. We can only address what is known and what is knowable. And when it comes to the number of volunteers we will need and in what positions we will need them, there's a fair amount of uncertainty moving forward, if we're honest. Now, our ideal number of volunteers and where we would place them, we've known that for a long time. This was what we knew before, like 2 months ago. But as we move forward into a new day, the ideal number of volunteers that we have and where we place them is something that we have to figure out. And it will be a changing ideal as new guidelines and behaviors reveal themselves. But fear not. There are a great many things that are indeed knowable that will allow us to pivot and adapt quickly to those changing circumstances if we uncover a few bits of information now. The amount of preparation we do has a direct correlation with our ability to leverage understanding against that uncertainty and make good, quick decisions that give us and those we serve with confidence in an ever-changing environment. Here's the thing. Because ministries in our churches often are siloed from one another, we only have an anecdotal idea of who is serving where in the church. And as I mentioned before, most volunteers serve in multiple roles. So in order to have a really good understanding to leverage against that uncertainty, we are going to have to collectively, as a church, audit our volunteer roles in every ministry area and then roll that up into one final view. This audit is not going to be easy for some of you, I know this, but please understand it will save you a great deal of time and frustration down the road. And I'll include a version of these audits that we're walking through so that you can print those off maybe, or if you would really like to get serious about it, I'm going to also include spreadsheets so that you can download and do this at scale. You're probably going to need to download and do this at scale, definitely for your whole church view. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to use these auditing tools to walk through the following 3 phases. The first phase is the ministry role audit. Then we'll talk about a volunteer role audit in just a few moments. We want to first identify the ministry area at the top of that page. And then we want to identify the existing roles within the ministry. Name every single role, list them all. It's really important. For each role, you will also then identify the current number of volunteers that you have in that spot. And now comes the really fun part. You'll need to identify whether each role remains as is. Does it stay the same? This means no changes to the title or responsibility of the role. It's good to go. Or is it paused? And paused probably means paused for a season. These should be really easy to identify, especially if you went through our second session earlier and identified ministry areas that you're pausing. You can just perhaps use those. And finally, is this role needing to be adapted for a new day? So does the greeter just simply get a new job description? Now, phase 2 of the ministry audit is for volunteers specifically, and this audit is really important for you to do for every role, even if the position is paused, because you may want to reassign these volunteers to new or vacant roles left by those who can no longer safely serve. It's time to name names in this audit because we're identifying the ministry area and the role at the top of the page. You're going to have one of these pages for each role. Then you're going to identify the names of the volunteers serving in the role, and then you want to identify how often they serve and in what shifts and service times. Now, unfortunately, this is also the place where we probably need to identify those that are part of vulnerable populations as outlined by the CDC because they're at great vulnerability of not being able to serve. And so we want to make sure that we identify those people. Now, phase 3. Phase 3 is the great roll-up. And this is not as hard if we've done the heavy lifting before. We can just roll up the individual ministry areas for a very accurate view of what areas in our church as a whole are at greatest risk and what areas have the most volunteer positions that are paused that we might be able to redeploy to our greatest areas of need. You also can, again, dig deeper here to understand who of your volunteers is at greatest risk and perhaps nudge them or help them find a safer role elsewhere. There's someone at your church that you're thinking of right now that's in that category. Maybe it's Alan, and Alan has been great on the doors, and he's the quarterback of the second service. He's been there for 10 years, but he is in a vulnerable population due to his health and his age. And maybe he could be great on the chat line, on the online service, or perhaps on the phones during the week. Regardless, we need to identify a place for Alan to serve and use his gifts in service to Christ. Now, you may have already been able to identify a safer place for him to serve up in phase 2, because remember, in phase 2, we decided what positions were safe and not safe for vulnerable persons. So that's why this whole auditing process is really important. If not, you may be able to find one in our next step as we walk through and talk through new roles that you may need at your church, and we also identify the skills that we need in those adjusted roles as well.